Can we start by establishing exactly what you are trying to achieve?
What we want to achieve is actually what a previous Conservative government did prior to some major European talks. When John Major had to go to the rest of Europe and negotiate the Maastricht Treaty, he first put, in effect, something very similar to a white paper to the House of Commons and said, these are my objectives, this is the way I want to try and approach these talks. Will you give me your backing or not? And incidentally, it's also exactly the same approach that Theresa May took under the coalition government when she negotiated a new deal on police and judicial cooperation in the European Union. So the precedent is there, and it's a very good precedent because it gives the government of the day much greater authority if it's negotiating with other governments with the backing of its parliament.
Of course, in those cases, there hadn't been a referendum of the whole country first. Can it be clear, however, if she comes to the House of Commons and says, this is the kind of Brexit deal that I want, and that's voted down, that means the House of Commons would vote down the way she wants to negotiate, make her position almost impossible, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, she'd have to go back and sort of improve her negotiating stance. Personally, I think Theresa May has absolutely nothing to fear. Everybody, including people like myself who campaigned for us to remain in the European Union, of course accept the mandate from the British people to pull us out of the European Union. But what the government doesn't have, because of course the Brexiteers they withheld from the British people what they meant by Brexit, is that whilst the government has a mandate to pull us out of the European Union, they don't have a mandate how to do that. And that is why it is important that the government strengthens its own hand and also just subjects its own ideas to the sort of scrutiny of Parliament before they go to the negotiations elsewhere in Europe.
And again, sorry, to be clear, if this vote happens and the government loses, then they can't trigger Article 50. So this could delay the triggering of Article 50.
Yes, and by the way, that would be a very good thing anyway, because I think Theresa May has made already a fundamental tactical error by saying, frankly, just to sort of throw red meat to her backbenches, that she's going to trigger Article 50 in March of next year, because she's already, in doing so, lost about a quarter of her negotiating timetable. Because as anybody in Europe, and I speak to many politicians across Europe, will tell you, nothing is going to meaningfully happen until the end of next year after the German election.
So this is an attempt to delay the triggering of Article 50?
Not at all. Not at all. It is an attempt to ensure that as the government pursues its mandate of pulling us out of the European Union, they do so in a workable way, a legal way, and crucially, in a way which doesn't throw the single market baby out with the EU bathwater.
Absolutely crucial question. Do you have the numbers?
I strongly suspect that if the government comes with a sensible, coherent plan for Brexit, they will win a majority across the sides in the House of Commons. This is not an attempt.
So you don't have a majority of, as it were, conservative Europhiles with the opposition, which could defeat the government on a substantive issue on the floor of the House
I
of
haven't
Commons.
been, I'm not a sort of whip. I haven't been sitting there in a whip's office totting up numbers. What I am keen to do, along with many MPs from all other parties, including a number of Conservatives, is to say, look, we live in a representative democracy where, yes, of course, the government has the mandate to pull us out of the European Union. It doesn't have the mandate to do that without any scrutiny or accountability from Parliament. By the way, to do otherwise is as absurd as suggesting that when a party wins an election, after that it should be able to do exactly what it likes, and Parliament should have no role whatsoever. We don't do that in our parliamentary democracy.
I put it to you that it is pretty clear what we were voting for at the time of the referendum. I was talking to Michael Gove, I can play the clip, but I said to him, does this mean coming out of the single market? And he said, yes, it absolutely does. It was absolutely clear that retaining or taking back control over immigration meant things that made our membership of the single market incompatible, and that therefore this sort of fantasy of a soft Brexit is simply a fantasy. No. I put it to you that you are actually trying to subvert the will of the British people in this referendum. They knew what they were voting for, and they were very clear.
Well, they weren't, of course, clear. Boris Johnson said we could stay in the single market. Apparently now people like Michael Gove and Daniel Hannan ludicrously claim that immigration had nothing to do with it, having, by the way, scared the living daylights out of everybody by claiming falsely that 8 million Turks would flood into the United Kingdom. Look, let's be clear. What is coming back to haunt the Brexiteers, which is why people like me are called Bramonas. I think they are in a state of Bruneial. They are Bruneiers because they are denying the mendacity of their original campaign. They deliberately withheld from the British people
both sides
any plan.
saying terrible porkies all the way through.
No, I don't actually think the Remain campaign in my view, was a listless campaign. It made some exaggerations. It didn't claim that we were going to get 350 million quid in the NHS every week. It didn't claim that there was a utopia awaiting us if we leave the European Union. It didn't claim that 8 million Turks would come here. But the point is this: if they had spelled out with one voice, in other words, if Farage, Gove, Johnson, and all this cast of opportunists and chancers had actually agreed on what Brexit was, then they would have a mandate to implement that plan. But they very deliberately withheld that from the British people. Why? Because they didn't have a plan they could agree on. And what's worrying is they don't still appear to have a plan which they can agree on about what Brexit actually means in practice.
It sounds to me as if you want Brexit to mean a so-called soft Brexit, trying to stay inside the single market, which is not compatible with the promises given during the referendum campaign.
Of course it is.
And that therefore you are trying to subvert what happened in the referendum, because you cannot take back control over immigration and end the free movement of people and stay inside the single market. That much is surely clear. Donald Tusk, Michael Gove may not agree on much, but they agree on that.
Well, I think they are both actually wrong. There are countries outside the European Union, such as Norway, which do have greater powers of control over who comes in and out of their country, and yet they have full participation in the single market. My own view has always been that if this government was smart, tough but also smart, with a bit of diplomatic sort of fancy footwork, it could actually square the circle on changing the sort of rules of freedom of movement, but retaining full membership of the single market. What it cannot do, which is what the Conservatives appear to be saying, and it's their contradiction, not that of the British people, that is skewering them now. You cannot say, I want untrammelled, unfettered access to a single market of rules, but I don't want to abide by any of those rules. That is impossible, but that wasn't a problem created by the 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit. That's a problem created by the contradictions within the Conservative Party.
So what do you say to all those Leave voters who look at you and say, here is a classic example of an establishment liberal trying to go behind the set, as it were, and fix the referendum result afterwards? This is exactly the kind of betrayal that we were frightened of.
No, if I was a Leave voter, which I wasn't, if I was a Brexit voter, I would feel increasingly betrayed that I voted in the belief that all these Brexiteers knew what they were doing. I put my faith in them. I put my faith in Gove and Johnson and Farage. And I would be increasingly angry, particularly as my electricity and gas prices go up, as I realise I can't take my kids on that holiday to Spain because it's now 20% more expensive. I'd be increasingly angry that these people, months after the referendum, still won't come clean about what they mean by Brexit, which is why they should come clean on the floor of the House of Commons.